Hello everyone, back again, week 2 with my multimedia discussion board. My name is Christy Giannoni and this is for our MPA 545 conflict resolution and labor negotiations. So for this discussion, I was taking a look at 4 different authors, some sections in the chapters that we've read so far. And the first one that I took a look at was in chapter 1 under theoretical perspectives, and it was the section that talked about defining conflict. So conflict is, and that is on page 2. So it defines it as discussion focusing on specific beginnings and endings of dispute, which makes sense, right? But I think the most interesting part that I found about it was where the author, I think it's Kupach and Canary, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, talked about the natural feature of the human condition. That's what conflict is. And there's a really funny illustration or story in the book that talked about, you're at an airport and some guy, sits right next to you and starts smoking a cigarette and playing this loud rock music, which isn't the kind of music that you like. And it's like that natural feeling. It's like instant conflict begins. And so they also talks about in this chapter and under the additional resource how we manage our interpersonal conflicts and that it powerfully affects our relationships more than any other kind of behavior. And I think that can be true in various different types of relationships with home, a spouse, with kids, trying to argue with little negotiators, obviously in the workplace. And it also talks about conflict having negative and positive consequences, which I thought was an interesting focus, because obviously there's, negative when the conflict is handled in a certain way, talking about, when people feel threatened, when people feel that something is, they're not being heard, that the communication is poor, and the positive consequences, which is what we're usually trying to get to when we have some type of conflict resolution, when we're in labor negotiations, when we're working on a successor MOU, those types of things. So it was kind of interesting, that definition, and then having that element of it being a natural feature of the human condition. Next, I took a look at chapter 2, conflict in action, specifically taking a look at conflict spirals, which is on page 17. And again, we're talking about those feelings that come up when there's conflict, right? And the reciprocated feelings are intensified. So if one person, that can change a whole labor negotiation process when one person starts to have these feelings where they feel threatened, devalued, insulted, and then it becomes personal and things escalate. And so that conversation will turn. And so the additional resource, this containment versus escalation, the trajectory of couples' conversational complaints, focuses on 4 ways to manage complaints. And so obviously it was talking about couples, but I thought it was very applicable to any type of conflict. And so the 4 ways is you can ignore it, you can refocus it, mitigate it, or work through them. So obviously I don't think ignoring it is very productive. Refocusing maybe in a conflict setting where 2 coworkers are having some type of dispute, but obviously we want to work through them if it's really about the labor negotiation process. Next, I took a look at chapter 3, negotiations and the negotiation process, specifically on page 47. And so it was talking about inventing options for mutual gain, which was one of the core values. First one was separate the people from the problem. Second one, focus on interests, not positions. And then this third one that I chose to speak upon, invent options for mutual gain, and insisting on using objective criteria was the 4th one. So the specific section that I thought was interesting was bluffing and credibility, and how someone's credibility can really affect the negotiation process. And so, if you have somebody who's maybe made some promises that they didn't go through with, or bluffed about, walking away, going through impasse, what that can mean for the future negotiations. And I think it can be a pivotal point, and there can be, a turning in the conversation if somebody is bluffing and, it doesn't work out, and that's kind of figured out by the other party. And then last, I took a look at, still in chapter 3, the factors that promote mutual gains in negotiations. So continuing off of that same theme, and this is on page 49, it talked about the ability to mirror back tentative understanding and eliminating ambiguities. which ends up accomplishing a couple different things. So one of those things is making sure that everybody's on the same page, basically, that we're talking about the same issue. There's an understanding of what we're trying to work for. And it impresses upon others that the negotiator understands them, that they see the point of where they're coming from. I think a lot of times just that listening factor is really important. And again, eliminates that ambiguity. There's no, confusion, which could cause even further conflict. There's a clear understanding and guideline. And so the win-win negotiating, turning conflict into agreement, talked a lot about the psychology behind conflict tactics. And I found it very interesting that they said that the same tactics that a police, psychologist could be using at a scene where somebody's maybe trying to hurt themselves, or they're in a situation where they're trying to negotiate them off of a high ledge or something like that, is the same tactics that can be used in labor negotiations and conflict in the office. And so kind of those core tactics for conflict was very interesting to read about. And this author, Jant, also talks about bluffing. And so I kind of thought that was interesting too, that both of the authors talked about bluffing, how that affects credibility, and how that can affect negotiating and conflict resolution in the future. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I look forward to seeing what sections everybody else spoke upon.